The night was colder than it should have been. Even for October, the air carried a heaviness that pressed against the trees, stilled the crickets, and made every sound feel like it came from far away. A single house stood at the edge of the valley, a forgotten structure of peeling white paint and warped wood, its windows faintly glowing with the kind of light that came from a dying bulb. No one should have been there that late, and yet someone was. A thin trail of smoke lifted from the old chimney, dissolving into the dark above the tree line. Locals said they had seen the light flicker on again 2 weeks ago. Before that, the place had remained dark for nearly 10 years. The last person who lived there never came back from the woods one morning. His name had faded from town memory, replaced by the legend of the man who went walking after the first frost and never returned. People claimed they had heard him sometimes, calling faintly through the fog that clung to the hills every fall. But those stories belonged to children, or to men who had too much to drink and needed something to blame for their unease. On that particular night, a truck pulled up along the dirt road that led to the house. The engine cut off and the forest swallowed the sound, leaving only the hollow echo of cooling metal. The driver remained inside for a while, staring through the windshield. The glass reflected the faint orange glow from the windows of the house, giving the illusion that something was alive inside. When he finally stepped out, his boots sank into the damp earth and the smell of wet leaves filled the air. He walked forward slowly, as though each step were a question he did not want answered. The door to the house was open, swinging faintly in the wind. He paused before the porch, studying the motion, the creak, the slow rhythm that matched his pulse. A whisper of warmth reached him from inside, carrying the scent of old dust and burnt pine. He hesitated, then called out. His voice seemed too loud against the silence bouncing back from the empty trees. No one answered. When he took another step, the floorboards groaned under his weight. Inside, everything was still. The light came from a single lamp resting on a small table beside the window. The walls were lined with shadows that shifted slightly as he moved, as though trying to avoid him. There was no furniture apart from the table, and a wooden chair lying on its side. He reached for the lamp, intending to turn it off, but the moment his fingers brushed the switch, the light flickered violently. For a brief instant, the entire room was illuminated in a burst of white. He saw something reflected in the glass of the window, something standing just behind him, too close to be real. He turned sharply. Nothing. The room was empty, silent, unchanging. The light steadied, humming faintly. His breath clouded in the air, though the lamp gave off heat. A slow sound began to rise somewhere deeper in the house. Not a voice exactly, but the low drag of something moving across the floor. It came from the back hallway past the narrow doorway that leaned crooked from years of decay. He froze. The noise stopped. For several seconds he could hear only the ticking of the lamp's old filament, the shallow hum of its weak electricity. Then from that same hallway came the faintest sound of breathing. Not his own. It was slow, deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was in there wanted him to hear it. He whispered again, asking if someone was inside. The air answered with a soft sigh, like wind moving through a cracked window. He took one cautious step forward. The floor beneath him creaked once and then gave a low cracking sound that spread through the room. The breathing stopped. The hallway was completely dark. He could barely see the outline of the doorway, where the wooden frame had splintered from age. He thought he saw movement, a shift, a darker shape within the dark, but he could not be sure. A faint smell reached him, sharp and sour, like something that had been soaked in water and left to rot. He wanted to leave. Every instinct inside him said to step backward, to get out, to let whatever memory lingered there stay buried. But curiosity pulled him closer. It always did. The same curiosity that had made him drive out there in the first place long after the warnings and the stories. The same need that haunted those who could not stand the thought of the unknown remaining unknown. He lifted his flashlight, though the beam trembled as his hand shook. The light reached the far end of the hallway, illuminating the narrow walls and the dust floating like ash. There was a shape there, something crouched low to the floor. Its outline was wrong, like it was half melted into the shadows. He blinked and it was gone. The sound came again, closer this time, a slow scraping along the wall. His pulse quickened. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against his skin. He stepped back into the living room, the light from the lamp now dimmer, pulsing softly. He thought he saw movement outside the window. When he turned, there were faces in the glass, Dozens of them, pale and watching, eyes reflecting the faint orange glow. But the moment he blinked, they disappeared, leaving only his own reflection. He backed toward the door, heart pounding. The wind outside had stopped. Even the trees were still. When he reached for the doorknob, his hand met something wet. He looked down and saw a smear of dark liquid across the handle. It smelled like rust. He stepped outside into the cold air, gasping, his breath visible in the moonlight. The truck sat exactly where he had left it, its headlights dimly reflecting the shape of the house. For a moment he thought he heard the door creak shut behind him, but when he turned it was already closed. He never saw who or what closed it. When the town sheriff found the truck 3 days later, the engine was still intact, the keys inside, the ground around it untouched. No footprints led to or from the house. The lamp inside was still on, flickering weakly through the window the same as it had the night before. But the man who had come searching was gone, gone like the others before him. Gone like the light that would soon fade once more. And somewhere in the hills, when the first frost covered the ground, people said they could still hear his voice, low, distant, calling through the fog. Asking a question no one wanted to answer. The house had always been there, long before the town itself had begun to crumble. Locals claimed it had been built at the turn of the century, though no one could find the original deed. It sat at the farthest edge of a forgotten lane that ended in forest, a place where the ground was uneven, and the air always smelled of iron after rain. When the wind blew from the north, the old wooden planks made a sound like low humming, as if the structure itself were alive and restless. In the early days, the area had been nothing more than farmland, miles of cornfields broken only by the occasional barn or mill. The town was small, built around a single church, a post office, and a diner that shut down before winter every year. Most people moved away once the nearby mines closed, leaving only a handful of families who stayed out of habit or stubbornness. The house at the end of the lane was one of the last standing structures from that time, untouched, unbought, unwanted. For years, children dared each other to approach it. They spoke of the man who once lived there, a quiet figure who came to town only on Sundays to buy canned food and kerosene. He never stayed to talk. No one knew where he came from or what he did for work. One winter, after a heavy snowfall, his footprints led from the porch into the woods behind the property. The next day, the house stood empty. His prints never came back out. When the thaw came weeks later, the sheriff organized a search, but the forest swallowed everything. No trace of him was ever found. After that, the house seemed to change. Even from a distance, something about it felt wrong. People described the windows as too dark, as if the glass absorbed light rather than reflected it. Hunters who wandered too close claimed their compasses spun in circles, and their dogs refused to approach the porch. During storms, the faint glow of a lamp would appear in the upstairs window, though no electricity ran to the property anymore. Decades passed, and time tried to forget. The surrounding land grew wild. Thorn bushes overtook the fences, and the once cleared fields became dense with trees. The house, though decayed, remained standing, as if the earth itself refused to reclaim it. Then, near the end of another long October, the light returned. It began quietly. A delivery driver passing through noticed the faint yellow flicker inside one evening and mentioned it to the sheriff. The sheriff dismissed it, thinking perhaps teenagers were trespassing again. But when deputies arrived the next morning, the house was locked and no signs of entry were found. Only the smell of burnt wood lingered inside, faint but distinct. A few days later, the town's only storekeeper began to hear whispers. Not voices exactly, but something like the sound of a conversation carried on the wind. The source always came from the direction of the old property. At night, the sound grew clearer, a pattern, a rhythm, almost human. He told his wife it reminded him of breathing. The townspeople were not the type to panic. They had endured enough silence and isolation over the years to dull their fear, but unease began to settle among them. Windows were shut tighter, dogs kept inside. The younger ones still dared each other to approach the house, but fewer returned. One boy, around 15, claimed he saw someone standing in the upstairs window when he got close enough to the gate. He described it as a tall figure with long arms, the head slightly tilted, watching him. No one believed him at first until the next morning, when his shoes were found by the gate soaked through with mud, but he was nowhere to be found. The sheriff searched the woods again. They found no tracks this time, no sign of struggle, no broken branches or prints. But when the deputies approached the porch, one of them said he felt something brush against his shoulder, though nothing was there. Another heard what he thought was a whisper right beside his ear, something like, "Go back." They did. From that night forward, no one entered the property again. The light would flicker on and off at irregular hours, sometimes in the evening, sometimes before dawn. Birds no longer nested near the trees that surrounded it. The grass grew yellow long before winter frost touched it. When autumn came in full, the air around the lane carried a stillness that made even the wind seem afraid to pass through. Then came the stranger in the truck, the one who disappeared. He was not from town, though he had been seen asking questions at the diner earlier that day. Some said he had been a journalist, researching old rural disappearances. Others believed he was just a curious traveler who had heard too many stories. He parked at the base of the lane, left his headlights on for a moment, then shut them off and walked toward the house. That was the last anyone saw of him. When his vehicle was discovered, people whispered that it felt like a warning. They said the earth around the property looked disturbed, as though something beneath had been moving. A few of the older residents who remembered the first disappearance crossed themselves quietly and said, "It always happens after the first frost." As the cold deepened that year, the woods seemed to close in tighter. The town fell into a pattern of quiet dread. Curtains remained drawn, and lights flickered in windows long past midnight. Some swore they heard tapping at their doors around 3 in the morning. 3 sharp knocks, always spaced the same way, always gone by the time they looked. No one spoke of it in daylight, but everyone knew. The season had changed. The air itself carried a memory of something ancient, patient, and awake. And every fall, when the leaves turned to rust and the first fog crept across the valley, the town felt the same thing again, the sense that the house was waiting for the next one to answer its quiet call through the trees. By the middle of October, the air around the old lane began to feel different. The wind that usually moved through the valley grew heavier, slower, carrying with it the faint metallic scent that everyone in town recognized but never discussed. The trees, stripped halfway bare by the season, leaned toward the house as if listening. People who drove past on their way to the next county said their radios lost signal near the turnoff. Some reported hearing static that seemed to pulse like breathing. Others swore they caught fragments of a voice between the noise, low, calm, repeating something they could not understand. The sheriff closed the road 2 days after the man's truck was found, citing safety hazards. Yet each night someone claimed to see light in the windows again. It flickered in uneven patterns, sometimes red, sometimes white, as though someone were walking from room to room holding a candle. But when officers went to check, the house stood silent and still, locked from the inside. The door was cold to the touch, colder than the air around it. At first, people tried to explain it away. The property could have been wired to an old generator. Perhaps squatters had found their way in, but when they cut power to the area completely, the light remained. It pulsed faintly through the window, steady as a heartbeat. The pastor at the town's small chapel spoke about it in his sermon that Sunday. He warned his congregation that there were places best left untouched, that the world held corners where sorrow refused to die. He did not name the house, but everyone knew what he meant. By evening, no one walked near the woods. Even the animals seemed to avoid the valley. Then the sounds began. It started with a single report from a farmer living a mile away. He told the sheriff that every night around 3, he heard the sound of something dragging through the fields. Not footsteps exactly, more like something being pulled slow and uneven, scraping against the frozen ground. He thought it might be a deer caught in wire, but when he went out with a lantern, the sound stopped, replaced by silence so deep he could hear his heartbeat. A week later, another neighbor reported hearing the same thing, though from the opposite direction. The sheriff dismissed it as coincidence, but the people in town began locking their doors earlier. They said the nights felt longer, that even the stars above the valley seemed dimmer. At the edge of town, an old woman who lived alone claimed she saw figures moving between the trees near the property. She described them as tall and thin, their faces turned away, drifting rather than walking. When she called out, they froze and vanished behind the fog. Her story spread quickly, whispered through the diner and the gas station until no one could tell if it had been truth or imagination. But it did not matter. Fear had already taken root. A group of teenagers decided to prove the stories false. On the night before Halloween, they drove out toward the house, laughing, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the cold mist. The next morning, their car was found parked at the end of the lane with the doors open, the headlights still on. Inside were 3 cell phones, all dead. The sheriff led a search party into the woods, calling out until their voices grew hoarse. By dusk, they found 2 of the teenagers huddled near a dry creek bed, shivering and incoherent. The third was missing. When asked what had happened, neither could explain. They said they had seen light in the upstairs window, just like the stories described. They entered the house calling for their friend, and then something changed. The air grew thick, like breathing underwater. The sound of footsteps came from the walls. Their friend had turned toward the staircase, drawn to a faint humming coming from above. The last thing they remembered was the sound of the door slamming shut on its own. When they awoke, they were outside, covered in frost, with no memory of how they had escaped. The missing boy was never found. The sheriff closed the investigation with the same quiet resignation that hung over every strange event the town endured. Officially, it was recorded as an accident. Unofficially, people began leaving candles in their windows at night. They said it was to guide lost souls home, but deep down they knew it was for protection. By November, the town felt hollow. Fewer cars passed through. The air carried the scent of rot and rain. Every evening, fog settled across the ground, creeping from the woods toward the houses at the valley's edge. When people opened their doors in the morning, they sometimes found wet footprints leading up to their steps, prints too long with a drag mark between them, as if something had been crawling. It was then that whispers about the house changed. It was no longer just a place tied to tragedy. People began to believe it was hungry. The story of the man who vanished in the truck returned to conversation. Some said he had gone there searching for truth. Others thought he had simply answered something that had been calling to him all along. Because that was the part no one liked to mention, the feeling that the house did not lure people by chance. It chose them. It called out to those who carried some quiet grief, something heavy and unfinished, and drew them in. Every fall, when the fog thickened and the frost began to bite, the air in the valley felt like it was holding its breath. Windows stayed closed. Lights flickered and died. And far away, where the forest met the forgotten lane, the faint orange glow of the old house would appear once more, steady waiting, and when the wind shifted, some swore they could hear it again, the dragging sound moving closer inch by inch, as if something long buried was trying to find its way back. The investigation that followed was not the first, nor would it be the last. When the sheriff finally requested outside help, a small team of state investigators arrived, carrying cameras, notebooks, and an unspoken sense of skepticism. They approached the house just after sunrise when the fog had begun to lift, but the air still clung to the scent of wet earth. From the distance, it looked like nothing more than an old farmhouse, slanted and exhausted from the years. But the closer they came, the quieter everything became. Even the wind seemed to die at the edge of the property. One of the investigators, a woman named Hale, wrote later in her report that the silence felt unnatural. She said it pressed against her ears until she could hear her own pulse. Her partner, a man named Rourke, noted that the soil surrounding the foundation appeared disturbed, as though something had recently been buried and then dug up again. No tracks led away from it. Inside, the air felt colder than it should have been. Their breath hung in front of them as they walked through the front room, taking photos of the lamp that had remained burning since the night the last man vanished. The bulb was still warm to the touch, though the wiring in the house had long been disconnected. They followed the hallway toward the back, where the boards bent slightly under their weight. Every sound they made seemed amplified, bouncing through the walls before fading into an unnatural hush. In the kitchen, they found claw marks along the doorframe, long and deep, cutting through the paint and wood beneath. Rourke suggested they were from an animal, though the spacing was too even, too deliberate. Hale noticed something else. Small dark stains on the floor, arranged in a semicircle as if something had been dragged from the table to the back door. The stains were old, dry, nearly black. The deeper they went, the more the house seemed to shift. Shadows stretched where they should not have. Corners appeared darker than the rest of the room, as though they held something unwilling to be seen. When Hale stepped into the narrow hallway that led to the staircase, her flashlight flickered once and went out completely. The backup light did not work either, but the lamp in the living room continued to burn, unwavering. They decided to split briefly, Rourke documenting the lower floor while Hale examined the staircase. The steps creaked softly beneath her boots. At the top, a narrow corridor stretched ahead, ending in a closed door. Dust covered everything except for one long, thin trail that ran directly down the center of the floorboards, like something had been dragged there recently. The smell was faintly sweet and metallic. Hale pushed the door open. The room was nearly empty, just a chair, a cracked mirror on the wall, and a single photograph lying face down on the floor. She picked it up carefully. It was blurred, water-damaged, showing what looked like a man standing beside the same window that now overlooked the overgrown yard. His face had been scratched out with something sharp. When she lowered the photograph, she noticed her reflection in the cracked glass was wrong. Her own face appeared slightly delayed, a fraction slower than her movement. Then, for one short moment, another figure appeared behind her reflection, a shadowed outline standing too close. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. Only dust swirled where her breath disturbed the air. Downstairs, Rourke called her name. His voice echoed strangely, as though it came from farther away than it should have. When she answered, he did not reply. She descended carefully, her flashlight now weak but working again. The moment her boots touched the last step, a sharp pop echoed through the house. The lamp in the living room shattered, throwing the room into darkness. Hale reached for her radio, whispering for her partner. Static answered first. Then faintly she heard him say, "Basement." The voice was distorted but clear enough to guide her. She found the door partially open near the kitchen, the smell of damp soil drifting up from below. She hesitated before stepping down, her hand brushing against the frame. The wood was wet, almost pulsing with warmth, as if alive. In the basement, the air was thick and cold. Her light revealed shelves of old tools, jars filled with murky liquid, and something covered by a large tarp in the corner. She called for Rourke again, but no response came. Only the faint drip of water somewhere in the darkness. She approached the tarp, her steps careful, deliberate. As she reached for it, something shifted beneath it, a sound like a sigh. When she pulled the cover back, what she found was not her partner. The tarp revealed a shallow pit carved into the dirt floor. Inside lay fragments of wood and rusted nails, remnants of what might have once been a small coffin. But it had been broken open from the inside. Her radio crackled again, louder this time. "Hale," came the voice. "Get out," she froze. It was Rourke's voice, but it was wrong. Flat, distant, as though spoken through water. The next sound was something dragging across the floor above her, slow and heavy, heading toward the basement door. Hale turned off her light and stood in the dark, listening. The dragging stopped right at the top of the steps. Then came the faint creak of the first stair. The report ended there. When the rest of the team arrived the next morning, both investigators were gone. Their cameras were found in the truck outside, their equipment still recording. The footage showed only brief glimpses: the interior of the house, the flickering lamp, the narrow staircase, and at the very end, a single frame that captured Hale's reflection in the mirror upstairs. Her face was blurred, eyes open, mouth slightly parted as if speaking. But no sound followed. The basement door had been sealed shut when they found it. Inside, there were no footprints, no sign of struggle, no evidence of what had happened. The only thing left behind was a faint pattern in the dust near the pit, long lines radiating outward, like fingers reaching for light. Later, analysis of the photographs revealed something else. In every image taken inside the house, even the empty ones, there appeared faint outlines in the background. Figures standing in corners, pressed against walls, or crouched low behind doorways. None had been visible at the time. The sheriff closed the investigation 2 weeks later. The official report cited structural instability and environmental exposure as the cause of the investigators' disappearance. But those who had seen the photographs did not speak about them again. Some burned their copies, others moved away quietly before the winter came, and still, the house remained. The lamp, replaced without explanation, glowed again in the window, and beneath it, faintly, something moved. The town never truly recovered after that autumn. It became quieter, smaller, as though the disappearance of those two investigators had drained something essential from it. People began to avoid one another, speaking only when necessary. Doors that had once remained unlocked were now sealed with chains, and the main street, once filled with laughter from the diner and the old barbershop, fell into silence by dusk. Even the church bells rang differently. They no longer echoed through the valley. They seemed to stop short, as if the sound itself feared to travel too far down the lane. Those who had lived near the property spoke less and less. They grew pale from sleeplessness, their eyes lined with red from nights spent staring out windows. Many moved away before winter, leaving behind homes half-packed and lights left burning. The few who stayed claimed they could hear something in the wind whenever night came. Soft, rhythmic, like slow breathing or the sound of something shifting through leaves. The sheriff changed after the investigation. Once firm and deliberate, he became withdrawn, almost spectral. He stopped attending town meetings, ignored calls after dark, and spent his evenings sitting on the bench outside his office with a flask and a cigarette. When asked about the case, he only said one thing: some places are not meant to be searched. His voice would always lower when he said it, as though the words themselves carried weight he did not want to disturb. Others felt it too, that sense that something unseen watched from the tree line. At first they thought it was paranoia, a trick of exhaustion and fear, but it grew worse as November deepened. One of the deputies who had been part of the original search began to lose his memory. He would wake in his car, parked near the lane, unable to recall how he got there. He quit his post soon after and left town entirely. The next deputy to replace him lasted only 3 days before doing the same. For the families of the missing, grief took on a strange shape. It did not fade or soften. It grew heavier, like a shadow following them through every hour. The mother of the missing boy was often seen walking the edge of the woods in the early morning, calling her son's name into the fog. Some nights others claimed they heard an answer, a voice distant and fragile echoing back the same name. Once the sheriff followed the sound into the trees, but when he returned his hands were trembling, and his eyes would not meet anyone else's. He locked his office and did not open it again for a week. The town's pastor tried to hold a vigil that winter. Only a handful of people came. Candles were lit, names were spoken, prayers were whispered, but as the night wore on, the candles began to go out on their own, one by one, until only the pastor's remained. He said later that he felt a pressure against his chest, as if something cold and unseen stood just behind him. He never held another service. By December, the first snow arrived, blanketing everything in quiet white. The footprints that sometimes appeared near the edge of the forest vanished under the frost. But that did not comfort anyone. Some nights, faint lights could still be seen between the trees, orange and pale blue flickering like lanterns carried by invisible hands. The older residents began to say the house was breathing again. That it always did, once the air turned cold enough to carry the weight of memory. Those who dared speak about it described strange dreams. They said they saw the missing standing in the woods watching from behind the trunks of black trees. Their faces were calm, almost peaceful, though their eyes were wrong, pale, empty, as if they belonged to someone else. In one of these dreams, a woman saw her son reach out to her and whisper, "You cannot wake me up." She woke, screaming, and did not sleep again for 3 days. Psychologists from the city came months later to study what they called collective trauma. They found a town locked in silence, its people unwilling to talk about what had happened. The word haunting never appeared in their notes, but it lingered between the lines of every report. Some residents described hearing whispers through the walls of their homes, even those far from the property. Others said mirrors no longer reflected them correctly. One woman swore she saw the reflection of her late husband standing behind her each night, though her house had been empty for years. Fear changed the rhythm of life. Children grew up without laughter. People stopped celebrating birthdays. The post office closed after the clerk refused to stay past sunset. The storekeeper, who once joked with everyone who passed, now refused to look out the windows after dark. He said that once, while closing up late, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the road, tall, motionless, its head tilted as though studying him. He turned away for a second, and when he looked back, it was gone. But he could still see the shape it had left on the frost-covered ground. Even those who had never believed in the stories began to feel it, the weight of the place, the slow unraveling of certainty. Sleep came with effort, and waking brought no relief. It was as if the valley itself had absorbed all the fear, storing it deep beneath the soil like something waiting to thaw. In the spring, when the thaw came and the snow melted, children found bones near the creek bed behind the woods. They were small and pale, smooth as river stones. The sheriff refused to collect them, saying they belonged to old animals. But those who saw the shape of the skull knew otherwise. After that, the children stopped playing near the water. Grief, fear, silence. They became the town's inheritance. Generations would carry it like a wound no one could see but everyone could feel. Some moved away, seeking the comfort of noise and distance. Others stayed, convinced that leaving would not help. That whatever had rooted itself there was not bound by geography but by memory. And every year, when the air cooled again and the leaves began to turn, a new wave of restlessness would fall upon the valley. Dogs would bark at nothing. Lights would flicker in empty houses. And somewhere in the distance, carried faintly through the trees, came the sound of breathing, slow, deep, and patient, like something that never truly slept. By the next autumn, curiosity had begun to stir again. Outsiders, drawn by the mystery, arrived with their cameras, notebooks, and the naive certainty that reason could explain what the valley refused to forget. Documentarians came first, 3 of them from a small online channel that specialized in paranormal disprovals. They entered the town in late September, optimistic and certain the stories were exaggerated. The locals warned them not to go near the old house after dark. They smiled politely, promised they would not, and then did exactly that. They parked their van near the broken fence that marked the start of the lane and began filming before sunset. Their footage, later found in the van's still-running camera, began normally enough. Interviews, laughter, light jokes about haunted legends. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the tone changed. The woman holding the camera commented that the temperature had dropped nearly 20 degrees in less than an hour. Her breath turned to mist, though the others did not. The audio recorded faint static and then, barely audible, a single word whispered near the microphone. It sounded like her name. The footage ended abruptly, the camera tipping sideways as if knocked from her hand. No one ever saw the 3 of them again. Their van remained there until winter. The town sheriff, weary and thinner than before, refused to retrieve it himself. He said the engine still ticked every night for weeks, long after the battery should have died. That incident reignited speculation, both rational and otherwise. The county declared the area off-limits, citing unstable ground and structural danger. But the theories spread faster than any official warning could silence them. Online forums began sharing drone footage of the valley, grainy photographs of strange lights moving between the trees, and voice recordings said to have been taken near the house. Some were easy to dismiss, others were not. A few academics from the state university proposed that the phenomenon might have geological roots. They noted that the valley sat on an old fault line and speculated that slow gas leaks or low-frequency vibrations could cause hallucinations and paranoia. They called it an environmental illusion, a convergence of natural elements mistaken for something supernatural. Their research received little attention. When 2 of them returned for a field survey the following spring, both reported persistent migraines, distorted hearing, and nightmares involving a flickering lamp in a dark room. One left the project soon after. The other never published her findings. Another theory emerged from the historical archives. A local historian combing through old property records discovered that the land beneath the house had once been part of a settler burial ground, unmarked and forgotten. In the late 1800s, during the construction of the first farmhouse, workers unearthed several small coffins. Rather than report it, they reburied them elsewhere to avoid delay. But the records ended abruptly. The new coordinates where the bodies had been placed were never written down. This revelation made sense to many. It explained the strange noises, the lights, the missing people, at least enough to give the town a story they could live with. The pastor, who had long since stopped holding service, said it fit perfectly with his belief that the earth remembers. He began visiting the edge of the lane again, leaving salt lines and silent prayers. But there were others who rejected every explanation that relied on the comfort of the physical world. These were the people who had seen things themselves, who had lost someone, who had heard the faint, deliberate breathing in the fog. They believed the house itself was a vessel, a kind of threshold between memory and absence. According to them, it did not haunt. It invited. One woman, who claimed to be the last surviving relative of the original owner, offered her own version of the story. She said her great-grandfather had built the house after his wife and daughter died of fever in the winter of 1892. Unable to bear their loss, he began studying spiritualism, a common obsession of that era. He filled journals with strange diagrams, Circles drawn inside circles, lists of names, phrases, and languages he did not speak. He believed that grief could anchor the soul to a place if the right ritual was performed. The family, she said, never left the house. Not truly. That story spread quickly, feeding the town's collective unease. Copies of her ancestors' journals surfaced online. Whether real or forged, no one could say. They contained sentences that made little sense, patterns of repetition, drawings of open eyes etched over and over. One page, scanned and shared widely, read, "Light must never die, for it holds the breath." The handwriting shook, the words carved deep into the paper. Skeptics argued that grief had simply created a myth and that generations of fear had turned coincidence into ritual. Yet even skeptics did not walk down the lane. They kept their lights on at night and looked away from the windows when fog rolled in. In late October, one final investigation took place. A private group of paranormal researchers arrived with high-end equipment: thermal cameras, motion sensors, digital recorders. They were confident, professional, untouched by local superstition. They entered the house just after midnight, transmitting live to their audience. The footage was clear for the first half hour. Dust, decayed wood, distant sounds easily explained by wind. Then the signal began to distort. Viewers reported seeing shapes in the static, faint outlines that lingered even when the camera moved. One of the team members whispered that she heard something humming under the floorboards. Another said the temperature around him dropped to freezing. A moment later, their audio captured a low, steady rhythm, breathing, unmistakably human, though no one in the group claimed responsibility. The camera panned to the staircase, and at the top, for less than a second, there was a figure. It stood perfectly still, head tilted, arms at its sides. The stream cut out. When a search team arrived 3 days later, the house was empty. All that remained was their equipment piled neatly on the living room floor. The lamp in the window was glowing again. After that night, the county fenced off the entire area. Signs were posted warning trespassers of hazardous conditions, though everyone knew the danger was not structural. No further investigations were allowed. The files, both police and academic, were quietly sealed. Still, the stories continue. Some believe the land is cursed by those disturbed graves. Others claim it is a rift between this world and another, a place where grief takes form and refuses to fade. But the few who have stood close enough to feel the cold say something simpler, something that feels closer to truth. They say the house is not haunted. It is alive, and it remembers everyone who ever stepped through its door. Winter arrived earlier than expected that year. The first snow fell before the leaves had fully turned, blanketing the valley in a silence that felt unnatural even for that place. The road leading to the lane was buried beneath frost. The fences vanished under white, and the trees bowed low as if exhausted from carrying what they had seen. The town, once restless, had gone quiet, not peaceful but hollow, as if waiting for something that everyone sensed but no one dared to name. The sheriff left without saying goodbye. His office stood empty, his files locked in drawers no one could open. On the desk sat a small object wrapped in brown paper and tied with a string. The tag attached read only, "For the one who asks again." No one touched it. The clerk who found it quit the next morning and refused to say what she thought might be inside. Through that long winter, the house at the end of the lane remained unseen, hidden behind walls of fog and ice. But the light stayed on. Even during the heaviest snow, when power lines fell and the valley lost electricity for days, a faint orange glow could still be seen flickering in the distance. Some nights it was steady. Other nights it pulsed, faint but deliberate, like a heartbeat too far away to reach. The townspeople tried to pretend it was over. They focused on simple things: chopping wood, repairing roofs, keeping the cold from seeping into their bones. But fear has a way of surviving. It hides in small habits, in the way a person keeps a lamp burning through the night, or the way they glance at their reflection in dark windows, afraid it might move before they do. Even children who had been born after the last disappearance knew better than to wander near the woods. They said it was not just haunted, it was awake. In February, a traveler passed through, a quiet man who said he was writing a book about forgotten towns. He spent a single night at the diner, asking gentle questions, taking notes. The locals answered cautiously at first, avoiding mention of the house, but when he brought up the missing people, their voices faltered. One woman said softly that she had seen one of them again, standing on the far side of the frozen pond at dawn. She said he looked exactly as he had the day he vanished, except for his eyes. They were pale and empty, reflecting nothing. The traveler went to see the property the next day despite their warnings. He told the owner of the gas station that he would be back by evening. His rental car was found 2 days later, door open, keys still in the ignition. The engine was cold, but the passenger seat was warm. The tracks leading from the car stopped at the gate. No prints returned. That same night, the light in the window grew brighter. It was no longer the faint glow of a single lamp. It shone strong and steady, cutting through the falling snow like a beacon. A few townsfolk gathered at the hill to watch from a distance. Some said they heard voices carried on the wind, low, echoing, layered as if many people were speaking at once. Others said they saw figures moving behind the curtain, shadows pacing from room to room. Then just after midnight, the light went out. When spring came and the thaw loosened the soil, the fence around the property collapsed. The sign warning trespassers rotted away. Grass grew tall, and the house seemed to sink further into the ground as though the earth itself was finally trying to reclaim it. Yet when dusk fell, the valley still held that faint metallic smell. Those who had lived there long enough said it meant the frost was remembering. Years passed, but the story did not fade. People moved in and out of the town, never staying long. The diner changed ownership twice. The church bell cracked during a storm, its last chime breaking into a sharp, unnatural tone. No one repaired it. Those who dared speak of the house described it as if it were alive in memory, breathing faintly, dreaming perhaps. Every October, just as the leaves began to curl and fall, new whispers would start. A hiker lost in the woods claimed to see the faint glow through the trees. A delivery driver reported static cutting through his radio near the lane. The same word repeating over and over, sometimes his own name, sometimes a voice he did not recognize. One autumn morning, a group of school children walking to class stopped in the road. The youngest girl, no more than 7, pointed toward the valley and asked why there was smoke rising from the woods. The teacher looked but saw nothing. Still, she felt a chill pass through her, and that night she packed her things and left town without telling anyone where she was going, and so it continued. Every generation the same rhythm returned. The house slept, the town forgot, and then something, a sound, a light, a whisper would wake it again. The sheriff's office, long abandoned, still stood at the center of town, its windows black and unbroken. Sometimes, when snow pressed against the glass, passers-by said they saw the outline of a figure sitting at the desk, head bowed, waiting for someone to knock. The paper-wrapped box was still there, untouched. When a state crew came to demolish the property years later, they found the land empty. The house had collapsed sometime during the winter, leaving nothing but a shallow pit and fragments of wood. Beneath it, they discovered layers of charred soil and something that looked like burned fabric. A camera lens melted at the edges was found buried in the dirt. No bones, no evidence of graves, nothing to explain what had happened, and yet one of the men swore he heard breathing beneath the ground, faint and rhythmic as if the earth itself were exhaling. He quit that night and never returned to finish the job. When asked about the site afterward, his only words were, "It is still there. You just cannot see it anymore." Today the lane does not appear on maps. The valley has grown wild again, overrun with pine and thorn, but the air still carries that same stillness. Travelers who drive too far off the main road sometimes report their engines stalling, their lights flickering out. When they step outside, they say the world feels different, quieter, heavier, as if someone were standing just behind them, listening, and somewhere in that silence, in the low hum of the wind against the trees, the faintest light still glows beneath the earth, not bright enough to see directly, not warm enough to follow, but alive, always alive. It flickers when the frost returns. It steadies when a name is spoken aloud, and if you stand there long enough, if you breathe in the cold and listen to the silence, you might hear it too. The sound of a door opening, the soft creak of footsteps moving closer, and a voice, faint but certain, whispering your name. Do you believe the house is gone? Or do you think it is still waiting for the next one who cannot look away?